Hello again. Today is Saturday, October the 19th, 2013, and it's a little after 3 o'clock my time. And I'm going to be doing two videos today, and this is video number 2 of 2. And it's concerning political parties and, in fact, political movements. I've been doing a lot of research and development of late, especially after and going through the midst of the so-called government shutdown. And I have been going through and looking at political parties and political movements over the last half century or so, and then even before that. And I found some interesting things that I want to share with you all in the hopes that it will be an informative piece and also an educational piece. But I found a quote that was very interesting. It comes from former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto. She said, and I quote, "Democracy needs support, and the best support for democracy comes from other democracies. Democratic nations should come together in an association designed to help each other and promote what is a universal value, democracy." End quote, close quote. I've been thinking a lot about former President Ronald Reagan of late, and I'm a great admirer and fan of President Reagan. Grew up under President Reagan's feet. Learned a lot from the man personally, and also from Mrs. Reagan as well. I was doing some research and had been doing some research for a long time on speeches that former President Reagan made, and this one in particular that I find very eloquent and that sums up political movements and political parties. And I'd like to quote that speech for you now. "Since our last meeting, we have been through a disastrous election. It is easy for us to be discouraged as pundits hail that election as a repudiation of our philosophy and even as a mandate of some kind or other. But the significance of the election was not registered by those who voted, but by those who stayed home. If there was anything like a mandate, it will be found among almost 2/3 of the citizens who refused to participate. Bitter as it is to accept the results of the November election, we should have reason for some optimism. For many years now we have preached the gospel in opposition to the philosophy of so-called libertarianism, which was, in truth, a call to collectivism. Now it is possible we have been persuasive to a greater degree than we have ever realized. Few, if any, Democratic Party candidates in the last election ran as liberals. Listening to them, I had the eerie feeling we were hearing reruns of Goldwater speeches. I even thought I heard a few of my own. Bureaucracy was assailed and physical responsibility hailed. Even George McGovern donned sackcloth and ashes and did penance for the good people of South Dakota. But let's not be so naive as to think we were witnessing a mass conversion to the principles of conservatism. Once sworn into office, the victors reverted to type. In their view, apparently the ends justify the means. The Young Turks had campaigned against evil politicians. They turned against committee chairmen of their own party, displaying a taste and talent as cutthroat power politicians, quite in contrast to their campaign rhetoric and idealism. Still, we must not forget that they molded their campaigning to fit what even they recognized was the mood of the majority. And we must see to it that the people are reminded of this as they now pursue their ideological goals, and pursue them they will. I know you are aware of the national polls, which show that a greater and increasing number of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, classify themselves as conservatives than ever before. And a poll of rank and file union members reveals dissatisfaction with the amount of power their own leaders have assumed, and a resentment of their use of that power for partisan politics. Would it shock you to know that in the poll, 68% of rank and file union members of this country came out endorsing right to work legislation? These polls give cause for some optimism, but at the same time reveal a confusion that exists and the need for a continued effort to spread the word. In another recent survey of 35,000 college and university students polled, three-fourths blame American business and the industry for all of our economic and social ills. The same three-fourths think the answer is more and virtually complete regimentation and government control of all phases of business, including the imposition of wage and price controls. Yet, 80% in the same poll want less government interference in their own lives. In 1972, the people of this country had a clear-cut choice based on the issues, to a greater extent than any election in a half-century. In overwhelming numbers, they ignored party labels, not so much to vote for a man or even a policy as to repudiate a philosophy. In doing so, they repudiated that final step into the welfare state, that call for the confiscation and redistribution of their earnings on a scale far greater than what we now have. They repudiated the abandonment of national honor and a weakening of this nation's ability to protect itself. A study has been made that is so revealing that I'm not surprised it has been ignored by a certain number of political commentators and columnists. The Political Science Department of Georgetown University researched the mandate of the 1972 election and recently presented its findings at a seminar. Taking several major issues, which incidentally are still the issues of the day, they poll rank and file members of the Democratic Party on their approach to these problems. Then they polled the delegates to the two major national conventions, the leaders of the parties. They found the delegates to the Republican convention almost identical in their responses to those of the rank and file Republicans. Yet the delegates to the Democratic convention were miles apart from thinking of their own party members. The mandate of 1972 still exists. The people of America have been confused and disturbed by events since that election, but they hold an unchanged philosophy. Our task is to make them see that what we represent is identical to their own hopes and dreams of what America can and should be. If there are questions as to whether the principles of conservatism hold up in practice, we have the answers to them. Where conservative principles have been tried, they have worked. Governor Meldrum Thompson is making them work in New Hampshire. So is Arch Moore in West Virginia and Mills Goodwin in Virginia. Jack Williams made them work in Arizona, and I'm sure Jim Edwards will in South Carolina. If you will permit me, I can recount my own experience in California. When I went to Sacramento 8 years ago, I had the belief that government was no deep, dark mystery, that it could be operated efficiently by using the same common sense practice in our everyday life, in our homes, in business, and private affairs. The label test of my theory, California was pretty messed up after 8 years of a roadshow version of the Great Society. Our first and only briefing came from the outgoing director of finance who said, and I quote, "We're spending $1 million more a day than we're taking in. I have a golf date. Good luck." That was the most cheerful news we were to hear for quite some time. California state government was increasing by about 5,000 new employees a year. We were the welfare capital of the world with 16% of the nation's caseload. Soon, California's caseload was increasing by 40,000 a month. We turned to the people themselves for help. 250 experts in the various fields volunteered to serve on forces at no cost to the taxpayers. They went into every department of state government and came back with 1,800 recommendations on how modern business practices could be used to make government more efficient. We adopted 1,600 of them. We instituted a policy of, quote, cut, squeeze, and trim, froze the hiring of employees as replacements for retiring employees or others leaving state service. After a few years of struggling with the professional welfarists, we again turned to the people. First, we obtained another task force, and when the legislature refused to help implement its recommendations, we presented the recommendations to the electorate. It still took some doing. The legislature insisted our reforms would not work, that the needy would starve in the streets, that the workload would be dumped on the counties, that property taxes would go up, and that we'd run up a deficit for the first year of $750 million. That was 4 years ago. Today, the needy have had an average increase of 43% in welfare grants in California, but the taxpayers have saved $2 billion by the caseload, not increasing that 40,000 a month. Instead, there are some 400,000 fewer on welfare today than then. 40 of the state's 58 counties have reduced property taxes for 2 years in a row, some for 3. That $750 million deficit turned into an $850 million surplus, which we returned to the people in a one-time tax rebate. That wasn't easy. One state senator described that rebate as an unnecessary expenditure of public funds, end quote, close quote. For more than 2 decades, governments, federal, state, local, have been increasing in size to 2.5 times faster than the population increase. In the last 10 years, they have increased the cost and payroll 7 times as fast as the increase in numbers. We have just turned over to a new administration in Sacramento a government virtually the same size it was 8 years ago. With the state's growth rate, this means that government absorbed a workload increase in some departments as much as 66%. We also turned over for the first time in almost a quarter of a century a balanced budget and a surplus of $500 million. In these 8 years just past, we returned to the people in rebates, tax reduction, and bridge toll reductions of $5.7 billion. All of this is contrary to the will of those who deplore conservatism and profess to be liberals. Yet all of it is pleasing to its citizenry. Make no mistake, the leadership of the Democratic Party is still out of step with the majority of Americans. Speaker Carl Albert recently was quoted as saying that our problem is, quote, 60% recession, 30% inflation, and 10% energy, end quote, close quote. That makes as much sense as saying 2 and 2 make 22. Without inflation, there would be no recession. And unless we curb inflation, we can see the end of our society and economic system. The painful fact is we can only halt inflation by undergoing a period of economic dislocation, a recession, if you will. We can take steps to ease the suffering of some who will be hurt more than others. But if we turn from fighting inflation and adopt a program only to fight recession, we are on the road to disaster. In his first address to Congress, the President asked Congress to join him in an all-out effort to balance the budget. I think all of us wish that he had reissued that speech instead of this year's budget message. What side can be taken in a debate over whether the deficit should be 52 billion or 70 billion, or even 80 billion preferred by the profligate Congress? Inflation has one cause and one cause only: government spending more than government takes in. And the cure to inflation is a balanced budget. We know, of course, that after 40 years of social tinkering and Keynesian experimentation, that we can't do this all at once, but it can be achieved. Balancing the budget is like protecting your virtue. You have to learn to say no. This is no time to repeat the shop-worn panacea of the New Deal, the Fair Deal, and the Great Society. John Kenneth Galbraith, who, in my opinion, is living proof that economics is an exact science, has written a new book. It's called Economics and the Public Purpose. In it, he asserts that market arrangements in our economy have given us inadequate housing, terrible mass transit, poor health care, and a host of other miseries. And then, for the first time to my knowledge, he advances socialism as the answer to our problems. Shorn of all side issues and extraneous matter, the problem underlying all others is the worldwide contest for the hearts and minds of mankind. Do we find the answers to human misery and freedom as it is known? Excuse me. Or do we sink into the deadly dullness of the socialist ant-heap? Those who suggest that the latter is some kind of solution are, I think, open to challenge. Let's have no more theorizing when actual comparison is possible. There is in the world a great nation, larger than ours in territory and populated with 250 million capable people. It is rich in resources and has had more than 50 uninterrupted years to practice socialism without opposition. We could match them, but it would take a little doing on our part. We'd have to cut our paychecks back by 75%, move 60 million workers back to the farm, abandon 2/3 of our steelmaking capacity, destroy 40 million television sets, tear up 14 of every 15 miles of highway, junk 19 of every 20 automobiles, tear up 2/3 of our railroad track, knock down 70% of our houses, and rip out 9 out of every 10 telephone poles. Then all we'd have to do is find a capitalist country to sell us wheat on credit to keep us from starving. Our people are in a time of discontent. Our vital energy supplies are threatened by possibly the most powerful cartel in human history. Our traditional allies in Western Europe are experiencing political and economic instability, bordering on chaos. We seem to be increasingly alone. Forgive me again. We seem to be increasingly alone in a world grown more hostile. But we let our defense shrink to pre-Pearl Harbor levels. And we are conscious that in Moscow, the crash buildup of arms continues. The SALT II agreement in Vladivostok, if not renegotiated, guarantees the Soviets a clear missile superiority sufficient to make a first strike possible, with little fear of reprisal. Yet too many congressmen demand further cuts in our own defenses, including delay, if not cancellation, of the B-1 bomber. I realize that millions of Americans are sick of hearing about Indochina, and perhaps it is politically unwise to talk of our obligation to Cambodia and South Vietnam. But we pledged in an agreement that brought our men home and freed our prisoners, to give our allies arms and ammunition to replace, on a one-for-one basis, what they expended in resisting the aggression of the communists who are violating the ceasefire and are fully aided by their Soviet and Red Chinese allies. Congress has already reduced the appropriation to half of what they need and threatens to reduce it even more. Can we live with ourselves as we, as a nation, betray our friends and ignore our pledged word? And if we do, who would ever trust us again? To consider committing such an act so contrary to our deepest ideals is symptomatic of the erosion of standards and values. And this adds to our discontent. We did not seek world leadership, it was thrust upon us. It has been our destiny almost from the first moment this land was settled. If we fail to keep our rendezvous with destiny, or as John Winthrop said in 1630, deal falsely with our God, end quote, close quote, we shall be made, end quote, a story and byword throughout the world, end quote, close quote. Americans are hungry to feel once again a sense of mission and greatness. I don't know about you, but I am impatient with those Republicans who, after the last election, rushed into print saying, quote, we must broaden the base of our party, end quote, close quote, when what they meant was to fuzz up and blur even more the differences between ourselves and our opponents. It was a feeling that there was not a sufficient difference now between the parties that kept a majority of the voters away from the polls. When have we ever advocated a closed-door policy? Who has ever been barred from participating? Our people look for a cause to believe in. Is it a third party we need, or is it a new and revitalized second party? Raising a banner of no pale pastels, but bold colors which make it unmistakably clear where we stand on all of the issues troubling the people. Let us show that we stand for physical integrity and sound money, and above all for an end to deficit spending, with ultimate retirement of the national debt. Let us also include a permanent limit on the percentage of the people's earnings government can take without their consent. Let our banner proclaim a genuine tax reform that will begin by simplifying the income tax so that workers can compute their obligations without having to employ legal help. And let it provide indexing, adjusting the brackets to the cost of living, so that an increase in salary merely to keep pace with inflation does not move the taxpayer into a surtax bracket. Failure to provide this means an increase in government share and would make the worker worse off than he was before he got the raise. Let our banner proclaim our belief in a free market as the greatest provider for the people. Let us also call for an end to the nitpicking, the harassment, and overregulation of business and industry, which restricts expansion and our ability to compete in world markets. Let us explore ways to ward off socialism, not by increasing government's coercive power, but by increasing participation by the people in the ownership of their industrial machine. Our banner must recognize the responsibility of government to protect the law-abiding, holding those who commit misdeeds personally accountable. And we must make it plain to international adventurers that our love of peace stops short of, quote, peace at any price, end quote, close quote. We will maintain whatever level of strength is necessary to preserve our free way of life. A political party cannot be all things to all people. It must represent certain fundamental beliefs which must not be compromised to political expediency or simply to swell its numbers. I do not believe I have proposed anything that is contrary to what has been considered Republican principle. It is at the same time the very basis of conservatism. It is time to reassert that principle and raise it to full view. And if there are those who cannot subscribe to these principles, then let them go their way. That was President Ronald Wilson Reagan, or then former Governor Ronald Wilson Reagan of California, in March of 1975 before the annual CPAC convention. I find it of interest that of late there have been those in the main and alternative news media streams and also in power who say to themselves and who say to you and I, at least those within the sound of their voice that are willing to listen to them for more than 5 minutes, who say, well, we've got to do it this way, or we've got to do it that way. Anything outside of Plan A or Plan B won't work. It's been proven that it won't work. I just got through reading a nearly 25-minute speech that Ronald Wilson Reagan gave in March of 1975 that is mirror image of what is going on in 2013, of the upheaval, the uprising, the power construct that is going on in 2013. If Ronald Wilson Reagan could philosophize and lament something that happened nearly 40 years ago to what is happening now, what does that say about us as a country? How far have we come? And my oh my, how history has a way of repeating itself. It is troubling to me, very troubling, that history so often repeats itself, that we can't seem as a people to put off and put down our old ways. We're unable to do that because we have a problem with new. We like status quo, we like things the way that they are, don't want to be interrupted, don't want to be affected. As long as me and mine aren't being bothered, it don't matter. Don't matter. Folks, we've got 330 million people in the continental United States right now. Okay? Nearly 2/3 of them are either out of work, homeless, they're most certainly hungry, they've got children that don't have clothes for school, don't have shoes for school, haven't been properly vaccinated, okay? Don't have access to breakfast, lunch, and dinner either at home or at school, okay? And don't have access to good quality education as a whole. My oh my, how history has a way of repeating itself. Yet, when somebody like, let's say, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. comes along, Dr. Vernon Johns comes along, Reverend A.D. King comes along, Reverend Ralph Abernathy comes along and says, wait a minute, what are you doing? What's going on here? Why is it so necessary for you to continue the same thing over and over and over and over again? Do as the good books suggest. Feed the hungry, clothe the poor, care for the widows and orphans. And you will be rewarded openly. But yet, we want to do the same thing over again. Oh, well, I'm sorry you're poor. I'm sorry you're hungry. I'm sorry you're sick. I'm sorry you don't have a job. I'm sorry you don't have a place to live. That really sucks. Blame this politician or this political party or this political faction. But never mind the fact that the solution is right there in front of you, and it's been there in front of you all along. All you got to do is look to it and lead by example. Do what it says. And if it's so hard for you to do, then we live in such a society and such a world that you don't have to participate if you don't want to. Ronald Reagan said that in his Let Them Go Their Way speech. And this was, keep in mind, this was in 1975. And here it is nearly 40 years later. Okay? Here it is nearly 40 years later in 2013, and we've got pretty much the same thing. The proverbial kicking of the can down the road. When does it end? When do we say, gosh, I've had enough here. I'm tired of looking at poor people. I'm tired of looking at sick children. I'm tired of looking at the disadvantaged and the unjustified. Let me put down and put off my status quo ways, roll up my sleeves, and go to work for the common cause of healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and caring for the widows and the orphans, the least of these. Let me put that off. I want to read one more speech for you. And this comes from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln, the former President of the United States of America. Quote, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Let me also read you a portion of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, and ultimately his last. The last portion. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with fairness in the right as God gives us, to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. My, oh my, his widow and his orphan. To do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but I intend to, and I work rather, every day, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, and to cast out demons in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and to care for the widows and the orphans, the least of these. I put down self. I take off self. And I think that you should too. And I think that the rest of those in the main and alternative news media streams, and those in command and control authority over us, should do likewise. When and if America as a whole, not as a sum, not as a part or a parcel, or a little bit over here or a little bit over there, or this faction or this fraction or this group or this movement or this effort, but all of America, all 330 million people living on the continental United States alone, excluding Alaska and Hawaii. It would be very nice if Alaska and Hawaii would kick in. God bless them. God love them. They are all part of our 50-state union. But it would be ever so nice if 330 million Americans would decide once and for all that we're going to care for the least of these, that we're going to do something of positive and lasting note. Something that maybe for whatever reason we think that people will little note or long remember. But maybe they'll take advantage of later on. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.